Vivid verses.
I remember the exact moment I knew I'd built something worth protecting. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind that smells like wood smoke and cooling asphalt, and I was standing on the small balcony of my apartment on Keswick Lane, holding a glass of Crestfield Cellars Cabernet, a mid-range bottle, nothing pretentious, watching the city of Harlow Falls settle into its nighttime rhythm below me. The restaurant across the street, a Portuguese place called Tavares, had its amber lights on and a small queue forming at the door. A couple argued quietly near the corner, then laughed, then walked away holding hands. A delivery cyclist cut through the intersection with the confidence of someone who knew every pothole by name. I was 34. I'd spent 7 years building Tatum Advisory, a boutique financial consulting firm that now had 11 employees, 3 anchor clients in the manufacturing sector, and a reputation for being the kind of firm that answered the phone when things went wrong. I'd done it methodically, without drama, taking on only what I could execute well. The office was on the 4th floor of a converted textile building on Parade Street. The floors were original hardwood. I'd negotiated a 10-year lease when the building's previous tenant collapsed, and people had told me I was taking on too much risk. Those same people had since referred clients to me. My name is Garrett Cole. I'm not, by nature, a romantic. I'm precise. I enjoy good food, long walks, chess problems, and the particular satisfaction of understanding how things actually work, systems, markets, people. I'm not cold. I just prefer to observe before I speak, and I've never confused volume with substance, which is part of why what happened with Simone lasted as long as it did. Because for a while, a genuine, real, uncomplicated while, it worked. I met Simone Ashford at a dinner party hosted by my closest friend, Brendan Okafor, at his townhouse on Callaway Street. It was one of those gatherings of 8 or 10 people where the wine is decent. The conversation moves through 3 or 4 subjects before settling on one, and by 10 o'clock, half the guests are sitting on the floor because the chairs have been claimed. Brendan was the kind of host who treated every dinner as a performance he was proud of. Good music, better food, and an intentional mix of people he thought would spark something interesting. Simone was a landscape architect. She had dark eyes that noticed things, the detail on a ceiling, the texture of tablecloth. And when she spoke about her work, she used her hands, drawing invisible structures in the air. She was funny in a dry, understated way. She asked questions that were actually follow-up questions, which is rarer than people think. We talked for nearly 2 hours, migrating from the dining table to the kitchen counter to eventually standing near the window with the city lights behind us. And when Brendan gave me a look across the room that meant "I told you so," I didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledging it. We had our first proper date at a place called the Carver on Morrison Row, dark wood, small tables, a menu that changed seasonally. She ordered the lamb and told me about a project she was working on in the Fenwick Hills district, a public park commission that kept changing shape because the city council couldn't agree on what kind of public they were designing for. She had strong opinions about this and expressed them clearly and without apology. I liked that. I liked her for a long time, in fact. 14 months, to be specific. We didn't move in together, which in retrospect was one of the better instincts I followed. We had our own spaces. Mine on Keswick Lane, hers in a ground floor flat on Dunmore Avenue with a south-facing garden she had, naturally, designed herself. We spent weekends together often enough to feel like a unit, but kept the weekdays largely our own, which suited both our rhythms. I traveled occasionally for client work. She had site visits that took her away for days at a time. This structure felt healthy. It felt like 2 adults conducting a relationship rather than dissolving into one. For the first 6 or 7 months, I had no complaints I considered significant. She was direct. Sometimes her directness had a serrated edge, but I'd grown up with a father who'd called things exactly what they were, and I didn't mind a person who said what they meant. That's not the same as criticism. Criticism is different. Criticism is structural. It's not what is said, but the architecture of the relationship it constructs. Criticism is what happens when someone uses honesty as a delivery system for something else. I noticed it first around month 8. A small thing. We were at a restaurant, Old Winds, the new Italian place near the waterfront, with another couple, friends of hers named Prida and Theo. The food was good, the conversation easy, and at some point I told a story about a negotiation I'd managed with a difficult client. I told it the way I always do, clean, factual, a little dry, with the emphasis on the logic of the thing. Simone laughed at the right moment. But afterward in the car, she said, "You don't have to perform your competence, you know." I looked at her. I wasn't. It just seemed like you were trying to establish something. I didn't argue. I filed it. By month 10, the comments had a pattern. I had learned to read patterns before I could ride a bike. My father was an actuary, and dinner table conversation in our house often involved probability trees. So recognizing a pattern is not, for me, a dramatic event. It's simply information. The pattern was this. The criticism arrived most frequently in social settings or immediately after them, and it was almost always framed as insight into my behavior rather than as personal preference. She never said, "I don't like when you do that." She said things like, "You have a tendency to," or "I've noticed that you often." This framing is deliberate. It presents itself as observation, even care, while functioning as a verdict. I pushed back once calmly. We were at her flat, a Sunday afternoon in February, gray light coming through the garden window. "I want to ask you something," I said. She looked up from her sketch pad. "Go ahead. The things you bring up after we've been around other people, the notes about how I speak or what I said, are those things that genuinely bother you? Or are they things you've decided are patterns?" She thought about it. "Both, I think." "Which one comes first?" She paused. "Then what do you mean?" "I mean, do you feel something and then you identify it? Or do you identify something and then decide it bothers you?" She didn't like the question. I could see that. She set down her pencil and said that I was overcomplicating a simple conversation, and I said I didn't think I was, and then we let it drop because there was nowhere else to take it that either of us wanted to go. But I learned something. She didn't know the answer, which meant she hadn't examined it. And a person who criticizes habitually without examining the mechanism of their criticism is not doing something they can stop. They're doing something they've stopped noticing. Month 12 brought the dinner at Brennan's again. He hosted seasonally. The October dinner was practically an institution at this point, and this time the gathering was 8 people. Brendan and his girlfriend Adiz, myself, and Simone, 2 colleagues of Brendan's from his architecture firm, and a couple visiting from out of town. The food was excellent. A lamb shoulder Brendan had been braising since morning, and the conversation was the kind that moved fast and got genuinely interesting after the second bottle. At one point, someone asked me about a widely covered case involving a mid-sized manufacturing company that had collapsed in a way that implicated its advisory team. The topic was in my domain, I had views on it, and I shared them. The table was engaged. Questions followed. I answered them. Simone said nothing at the table. In the car going home, she said, "You really don't leave much room for other people when you're in that mode." I kept my eyes on the road. Which mode is that? The expert mode. The authority mode. People ask me questions. You could have redirected. I thought about that. Why would I deflect questions I'm equipped to answer? Because it isn't always about being equipped. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say to that which would resolve it, because what she'd said wasn't, at its core, about the dinner party. What she'd said was a statement about me, about a quality she decided was a flaw. And no amount of explaining or adjusting would change that, because the target would simply move. I'd seen this before in professional settings. A client who is never satisfied with a report is usually not dissatisfied with the report. They're dissatisfied with something that precedes the report, and the report is just the most recent surface on which to project that dissatisfaction. The question was what she was actually dissatisfied with. Month 13 was the quietest. Not the good kind of quiet, not the comfortable kind, the kind you share with someone when words aren't necessary. The taut kind, the kind that forms when two people are each waiting to see what the other does next. I noticed she'd started asking more questions about my schedule. Not with suspicion, not overtly, but with a frequency that didn't match her previous habits. Where was I having lunch? Who was the meeting on Thursday? Was it the client from Bassett Group or the new one? I answered because they were reasonable questions in isolation. But I have a good memory. I noted the frequency. I noted that she rarely mentioned her own schedule with equivalent detail. I also noticed that Brendan, who I saw every week or two for chess and coffee at a place called Foundry Grounds on the edge of the Parade Street quarter, occasionally knew things he shouldn't have known. Small things. That I'd been frustrated with a particular project. That I considered dropping a client. That I'd been thinking about taking on a junior partner. Things I'd mentioned to Simone in passing, in the way you talk to a partner. Casually, honestly, without inventorying what you've disclosed. I didn't confront Brendan about it then. I wasn't certain enough, and I'm not the kind of person who makes accusations on inference alone. But I began to be more deliberate about what I said to whom, and I began to watch the flow of information the way you watch water, noting where it moved, noting where it pooled. The end came on a Saturday in late November. We'd been to a small dinner, 3 couples, hosted by friends of Simone's named Raphael and Celia at their place in the Dunwich district. Raphael was in urban planning, Celia was a ceramicist, and their home was one of those spaces that felt curated without being cold. Good art, warm light, a long table with mismatched chairs that worked. The conversation was fine. I was relatively quiet because I was genuinely listening more than contributing. I didn't know these people well, and I was interested in who they were. Walking back to the car, Simone said, "You were very withdrawn tonight." I was listening. I don't know Raphael and Celia well. You've met them twice. Right. So I was listening. She stopped walking. I stopped too and faced her. The street was empty except for a cat sitting on a garden wall, watching us with total indifference. "This is what I mean," she said. "You have a reason for everything. Every behavior has an explanation. It's like you're always pre-defended. I explained myself because you raised it. You always do this," she said. And I heard it. The always, that precise word. The one that forecloses every case and renders every evidence irrelevant. I looked at her for a moment. Not with anger. Not with hurt. With clarity, which is a different thing entirely. "I think we should talk," I said. "Not here. Let's get back." We sat in her kitchen, the garden dark outside the window, a pot of tea between us that neither of us was drinking. She was waiting for me to speak first because I'd initiated this, and I respected that logic, so I did. "I want to be honest with you," I said. "And I want to say it plainly because I think that's more respectful than softening it." She nodded slightly. "This isn't working," I said. "And I don't think it's because of incompatibility. I think it's because there's something happening in the way you relate to me that I don't think is good for either of us. The pattern of criticism, the notes after social events, the framing, the always and you tend to. I've tried to understand where it comes from, and I've tried adjusting, and neither of those things has changed the underlying dynamic." She was quiet. Her hands were around her mug. "I'm not saying you're a bad person," I continued. "I'm saying that what you're doing is a behavior that I don't think you've examined, and I don't think you want to hear that, which is partly why I'm ending this rather than trying to work through it." "You're ending it," she said. "Yes, because I criticize you, because the criticism is constant, and because when I've raised it directly you've deflected, and because I've watched the pattern for 6 months and it doesn't change. That's the information I have." She was silent for a long moment. Then, "You've been thinking about this for 6 months?" "I've been observing for 6 months," I said. "I've been deciding for much less time." There was more conversation after that. She was hurt, genuinely, I think. And she said things that were meant to destabilize, to make me question my account of what had happened. She called it cold. She said I'd been disengaged. She said I never fought for anything. I let her say all of it because she had the right to, and when it slowed down, I said, "I hear you. I disagree with parts of it, but I hear you." Then I left. I drove home along the river road, the long way, and by the time I parked on Keswick Lane and sat in the car for 3 minutes, I felt something I didn't expect. Not relief exactly, but something like alignment. The sense of an interior and exterior life that matched each other again. I gave myself 2 weeks of deliberate recalibration. Not avoidance. I kept to my routines, saw clients, went to the gym on Renner Street, cooked actual meals instead of ordering in. I didn't tell many people about the breakup because it wasn't anyone else's business, and I didn't want the conversational overhead of other people's sympathy, which, however well meant, tends to add weight rather than remove it. Brendan knew. Of course. He was my closest friend, had been since we'd ended up in adjacent rooms during the first year at Carrington University. Two people who didn't need constant company but appreciated finding someone else who thought like that. He texted and asked how I was. I told him I was fine, which was accurate. He asked if I wanted to meet. I said not yet, which was also accurate. What I was doing in those 2 weeks was something most people don't take time to do after a relationship ends. I was reviewing the ledger. Not emotionally, not to assign blame or manufacture narrative, but practically. What had I disclosed? To whom? When had Brendan known things he shouldn't have known? I went back through months of ordinary conversation in my mind, not trying to reconstruct every word, but tracing the outline of what had been shared. It clarified faster than I expected. There had been 4 or 5 moments. I identified them with what I thought was reasonable certainty, where Brendan had referenced something I'd only told Simone. The joint account I'd been considering for the firm, which I'd mentioned to Simone during a walk along the Fenwick Path one evening, and which Brendan had casually asked about 3 days later. The frustration I'd had with a particular colleague, expressed to Simone privately, which Brendan had referenced in a way that matched my phrasing too precisely to be coincidence. The evening I'd told Simone I was staying late to finish a report, something I'd mentioned nowhere else, and Brendan had texted me that same night asking if I needed company, unprompted. The data wasn't damning on any single count. The data was damning in aggregate. I'm not someone who likes being wrong. I have enough self-awareness to know this is not a strength. Exactly. Liking being right is its own kind of liability. But I'd extended considerable trust to Brendan over more than a decade, and what the data suggested was that he'd been using that trust as a currency he'd offered to someone else. I wanted to be wrong. I thought about every alternative explanation. I gave each one a fair assessment. They didn't hold. I called him rather than meeting in person. I did this deliberately, not because I wanted to make it easier on myself, but because a phone call removes the visual social pressure that makes people manage their reactions rather than expressing them honestly. I wanted to hear what he actually said, not what he performed. "Hey," he said when he picked up. "How are you doing?" "Better. I'm well," I said. "I wanted to ask you something directly, and I want you to take the question seriously before you answer." A pause. Something shifted in the quality of the silence. I noted it. "Of course," he said. "What's up?" "Did you share information with Simone? Conversations we'd had? Things I'd told you? Without my knowledge or consent?" Silence. A genuine one this time. Not the pause of someone constructing an excuse, but the pause of someone who has been waiting for something they knew was coming. "Then, Garrett." His voice had changed. "Yes or no first," I said. "Then whatever else you need to say." "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll let that sit." It started, he began. I know when it started, I said. I don't need the origin story right now. I want to understand the mechanism. What was the arrangement? His account came out in fragments, the way confessions do, halting and slightly out of order, with self-justifying detours he kept abandoning when he heard how they sounded. Simone had come to him early, he said, 6 months in, maybe 7. She'd been worried. That was the word she'd used, worried about me. She'd said I was distant, that she felt like she couldn't read me, that she was trying to understand me better and didn't know how. She'd framed it as asking for help with the relationship. She'd asked small questions at first. Was I under stress? Did I tend to withdraw when things were difficult? Was there something in my history she should know about? And Brendan had answered. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally. A sentence here, a detail there. The kind of sharing that doesn't feel like betrayal in the moment, because each individual piece seems harmless. And the questions had shifted. They become more specific, operational. Where was I likely to be on a given evening? Had I mentioned a particular meeting? Had I said anything about the state of the relationship from my side? And at some point, and this was the part where his voice got quietest, Brendan had understood that he'd crossed something, and instead of stopping, he'd kept going because stopping would have required acknowledging what he'd already done. She made it feel like caring, he said, like it was for your benefit. I know how that works, I said. I should have stopped. I should have told you months ago. His voice broke slightly. Garrett, I'm genuinely sorry. I don't have an excuse. I got manipulated and I let it happen and I kept it going because I didn't know how to undo it, and none of that is your problem. It's mine. He was crying. Quietly, the way people cry who don't do it often. I heard it clearly. I felt something, not nothing. I want to be honest about that. It was grief, a specific kind, the particular grief of losing something you'd thought was one thing and understanding it was another. Brendan had been my closest friend for 12 years. I had attended his mother's funeral. He had been the person I called at 2 a.m, twice in my life, when things had been genuinely bad. That was real. None of what had happened erased that it had been real. But it didn't change the geometry. I appreciate the honesty now, I said. My voice was even. I mean that. It takes something to say what you just said without trying to minimize it. Thank you, he said, barely audible. But our friendship is also over. You chose to enable someone's unhealthy behavior. For months, you made a choice, repeatedly, to give someone access to my private life. And whatever justification existed in the beginning, and I can see there was one, the justification didn't last, and you continued anyway. That's not something I can build on. You said my name once. Just my name. I genuinely wish you well, I said. That's not a formality. I hope you do something useful with what happened here. I paused. Take care of yourself, Brendan. I ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table for a while. The city sounds came up from outside. A bus, someone laughing below, the distant rhythm of the Tavares kitchen at the end of a Friday service. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. Then I opened my laptop and worked for 2 hours on a client report that needed finishing, and I worked cleanly without distraction, and it was good work. Here is something I've noticed about people who've experienced something that shook them. They almost immediately begin telling a story about it. The story involves a clear villain, a lesson they didn't know they needed, a changed self on the other side. The story is comforting. It is also almost always too simple. I don't want a simple story. I want an accurate one. The accurate story is this. I was in a relationship with someone who had developed a habit of criticism that she was not equipped to examine. I ended it when the evidence was clear. I then discovered that someone I trusted had been providing her with information about me without my knowledge. I ended that relationship too, with as much honesty and as little cruelty as I could manage. These are the facts. They don't require embellishment. What they do require is that I update my understanding of what had gone wrong and what I had contributed to it, if anything. I spent a fair amount of time on this. Not guilt. I don't engage with guilt productively. It tends to loop rather than resolve, but analysis. What I concluded was this. I had noticed the pattern in Simone far earlier than I'd acted on it. I had given it time to change on its own, which in retrospect was more optimism than the evidence warranted. With Brendan, I had perhaps been less attentive to small anomalies than I should have been. There had been signals I'd downgraded because I trusted him. Trust is efficient, but efficiency is a trade-off. I understood that more precisely now. Neither of these conclusions called for self-recrimination. They called for adjustment. Rebuilding a social circle, I discovered, is an interesting project if you approach it without desperation. Most people do not approach it that way. Most people, after a major social rupture, a breakup that fragments a shared group, a falling out with a close friend, move too fast. They fill space immediately, pursuing the sensation of having people around more than the reality of having people worth having around. I'd watched others do this enough to know the pattern, and I had no interest in replicating it. What I did instead was become more deliberate about existing connections I'd allowed to thin. There was a man named Porter Hines. I'd known him through work, initially a former client who'd moved into a different sector. Porter was quietly brilliant, the kind of person who read everything and remembered most of it, and who expressed opinions only after considering them, which I found genuinely rare. We'd had lunch a few times over the years, always good, always running longer than planned. I called him and said I wanted to resume that habit. He said it sounded good. We met at Aldwin's, the waterfront Italian place, and talked for 3 hours about infrastructure investment, a book on decision theory he'd been reading, and the particular problem of cities that had stopped knowing what they were for. It was the best conversation I'd had in 6 months. There was a woman named Carla Voss, a graphic designer I'd met through a professional networking event 2 years earlier. She designed some collateral for Tatum Advisory early on, and I'd appreciated her work enormously. Clean, precise, not a wasted element. And we'd stayed in occasional touch. I ran into her at Foundry Grounds one morning, and we ended up sitting for an hour. She was sharp and funny and interested in more things than were strictly useful to her professionally, which is the best quality in a person. We exchanged numbers again, properly this time, with the intention of using them. I was introduced, through a client, to a man named Theo Bassett, unrelated to the client firm, who was building a network of community workshops in the industrial quarter east of the city. The project was structurally interesting, and he needed advice on the financial modeling. We worked together for 6 weeks, and somewhere in that process, I realized I genuinely liked him. He was the sort of person who laughed at the right things and didn't need you to pretend anything. I went to the opening of the first workshop location, a former metalworking space on Colton Road, all exposed beams and proper ventilation. And it was one of the better evenings I'd spent in months. These were not replacements. You don't replace people. That's not how this works. But you do, if you're paying attention, find that the world has more people of quality in it than you've been noticing, partly because quality is quiet and you have to be quiet yourself to hear it. Spring came in the way it does in Harlow Falls, slowly at first, then suddenly, a week in March where the temperature shifted by 15 degrees and everything that had been locked under gray sky seemed to release at once. I kept my routines. I woke early, I ran the river path, I worked hard, I ate well. The firm was doing well. We'd added a 12th employee, a young analyst named Rosa Tierney, who had a gift for finding the thing in a dataset that everyone else had looked past. I had a plan on my desk that I'd been keeping alive for 4 months, which was not a record, but was progress. I thought about Simone occasionally, not with regret exactly, and not with the easy contempt that some people resort to as a way of tidying up. She was a complex person who had developed a behavior pattern that had damaged what we'd had, and who had, at some point, chosen to involve my closest friend in monitoring me, which was not the action of someone in a healthy state. I hoped, in the most abstract and genuine sense, that she eventually understood what she'd been doing and why. Not for my benefit. I had no stake in the outcome, but because people who do not understand the mechanisms of their own behavior tend to carry them forward. I thought about Brendan Moore, and with a different quality of feeling. What he'd done had been a fundamental breach, and my decision to end the friendship had been the right decision. I revisited it once in the clean light of Sunday morning and confirmed this, but I didn't think he was, at his core, a bad person. I thought he was a person who had made a series of small bad choices and hadn't found the internal authority to stop them. That's a different problem than malice. It's in some ways a sadder one. I didn't wish him ill. 8 months after the break, Carla introduced me to a group of people she described as loosely organized and impossible to schedule, but worth the effort. They met periodically, no fixed frequency, usually at someone's apartment or at a quiet bar called the Whetstone on Albion Street, near the University District. Architects, a civil engineer, 2 people who worked in documentary film, a botanist who taught at Harlow Falls University and had a manner of absolute authority when discussing anything biological. The conversations were good, genuinely good, the kind that went somewhere unexpected and left you thinking about them the next day. I went twice before I relaxed into it. Old habit. I observe before I commit, and these were people I didn't know. By the 3rd gathering, held at the documentary filmmaker Joanna's apartment, which was covered in pinned research and smelled pleasantly of coffee and old paper, I felt something I recognized as belonging. Not the desperate kind, the earned kind, the kind that feels like recognition rather than admission. Porter came to one of these evenings, and his particular combination of erudition and dry humor made him an immediate asset. He and the botanist, whose name was Dr. Featherstone, she insisted on the title, laughingly but consistently, had an argument about long-term infrastructure that became the most interesting 40 minutes I'd witnessed at a social gathering in years. Theo came to another. He and Joanna discovered they'd both been trying to do essentially the same thing in different domains. She was working on a documentary about the East Quarter's industrial history. He was trying to preserve and repurpose it, and by the end of the night, they were talking about collaborating. I watched this and thought, this is how a good circle forms. Not through the performance of connection, not through proximity alone, but through the introduction of quality to quality and the compounds that result. I had not manufactured this. I had simply made choices, deliberate, unrushed choices, about who I spent time with, and the result was something that had its own momentum. Late one evening in September, I was walking home from the Whetstone along the river path, the city lights doubling themselves in the dark water below. The air was cooling again, the first true hint of autumn, and I could smell the Portuguese place from half a block away, that familiar scent of garlic and sea salt that had become, over 4 years on Keswick Lane, as much a part of home as the view from my balcony. I had a client meeting in the morning. Rosa had flagged something interesting in the Bassett account that I wanted to think through properly before we sat down with them. I had dinner with Carla and her partner on Thursday, and the monthly gathering was Friday. Porter had sent me an article about game theory in urban planning that I hadn't read yet. I was looking forward to it. My life was good. I knew that with the particular clarity that comes not from comparison, not better than before, but from direct assessment. This was a life that made sense from the inside and the outside simultaneously. Its interior and exterior aligned. The space where Simone had been and where Brendan had not been filled. That's not how structural integrity works. You don't fill voids. You rebuild around them until they are no longer load-bearing. I stopped on the bridge at the end of the river path, the old iron one that the city had threatened to replace for 15 years without ever doing so, and leaned on the railing for a moment. The thing about trust, I've thought about this often in the past 8 months, is that it's not a blanket you spread over people, hoping it keeps everyone warm. It's a resource, and like any resource, it has to be allocated carefully, not withheld. Hoarded trust becomes a kind of armor, and armor is heavy and limits movement, but allocated. Given to people who have, by their actions and not just their words, demonstrated that they understand what it costs. Porter understood it. Carl understood it. Theo, in his straightforward way, understood it. Dr. Featherstone, who had told me once, quite bluntly, that she disagreed with my read on a particular situation and had then demonstrated precisely why she was right, understood it in the way only genuinely confident people do. These were people I was building something with, not a performance, not a structure that required someone else's interpretation to know what I thought or felt or said. Just people, and between us, something honest. I stood on the bridge a moment longer, watching the water. Then I straightened up, put my hands in my pockets, and walked home. There was a good report to finish, good work to do in the morning, and the particular satisfying weight of a life that was, by every measure I trusted, entirely my own.
Thanks for listening.